Welcome to Data-Driven Leaders, a podcast for business and technology leaders who are trying to shape and influence the future of data and analytics. In each episode, we feature conversations with data-driven leaders who are at the forefront of using data to solve complex business challenges. Let's jump in now and uncover some of the biggest challenges today's data-driven leaders face and find out what it really takes to build a data-driven culture.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Data-Driven Leaders. I'm your host, Christina O'Reilly, and this episode is brought to you by Gen Squared, a consulting firm dedicated to solving data analytics challenges. So today we're going to talk about value, specifically driving value through data analytics. Organizations know there's a lot of value in their data, but most are struggling with not only accessing it, but struggling to incorporate the insights from their data into day-to-day business processes. So why are they struggling? Well, according to our guest, he believes companies need to rethink the way they create value and grow their businesses. Joining me today is someone who could probably write a book on value creation. He has over 30 years of senior leadership experience and is an industry leader in structuring, building, and optimizing business operations for large real estate portfolios. Welcome, George Van Noten. It's great to have you today.
Good morning, and thank you for asking me.
So, given your extensive experience, I suspect you have a thought or two in value creation. But before we dive right into things, maybe you can share with our audience a bit more of your background as it relates to our topic.
I started off in the hotel industry roughly 30 years ago. I started with CP Hotels and then later sort of folded into Fairmont and Delta and so on. And very early on in my career, Christina, I was responsible for overseeing revenue optimization for the company, and specifically Delta Hotels and Resorts. And I was charged with being part of a team that decided and built out our revenue management strategy nationally and then eventually rolled up into Fairmont globally. And at the heart of revenue management is really the collection of data and anticipating the various trade-offs that you might make in order to unlock value. The hotel industry, the airline industry were really some of the first industries to move down this path of data-driven, smart revenue management tools. And so we were a little bit late getting to the party as a company, but in doing so, we really started to dig deep into our customers, the profile of our customers, the profitability of our customers, the channels in which they purchase through, and learned quickly that if we could optimize everything from how they bought to the channels they used to the cost and the profitability of each customer, we could have a material impact on our margins and our bottom line. And so that was probably about 20 years ago. And I think that was really sort of that eye-opening moment for me. And then that kind of rolled into really underwritings and pro formas. I was heavily involved in acquisitions of hotels, and then eventually left the industry and got involved with real estate more broadly speaking. And so going from then underwriting and thinking about how do we acquire something and then unlock the value of it. Again, the foundation of that is really information and data, and then driving insights that might build out or inform your strategy going forward. And so I was heavily involved really up until I retired in really the pro formas. And so that's kind of maybe a long-winded answer to how I got here. And it was probably forced into it more than it was by choice in the early days.
Right. So we're talking about the value of data, and you just referenced it earlier. So in your opinion, how are we defining it today, and should we be defining it the way we are today? Like, what are those challenges that you're seeing?
God, I see so many challenges with it. I mean, first of all, I think you need to think of data as if it were an asset, as if it were actually money. And so if you think about the diligence and the care that you would put into a cash register, do you treat data in the same way? Because it has inherent value. But let me park that for a second. In my perspective is that, particularly in publicly traded markets, value is often defined by earnings per share. And it's recorded or reported on every 90 days with a group of analysts. And in doing so, I think you miss the opportunity to unlock value elsewhere in the organization. Now, let me give you an example. We compete for employees. What is the value proposition for them? We compete for customers. What is the value proposition? We compete for capital. We compete for suppliers. And so as you start to think of all of the components that form your business model, there is value not only in each one of those verticals, but there's value across those verticals. And how do you leverage that? And in the hotel industry, what we started to do was able to pool data that looked at not only what our revenue was by channel and the cost of sale, but we also looked at the profitability. So we could tell you that a business traveler would book last minute. So we wanted to make sure that there was a unit available, a suite available. They would often be upgraded. They would often have a steak dinner and have a nice bottle of wine at dinner. They would have breakfast. They may watch movies at night. We knew not only what their buying habits were, but the profitability of their steak dinner, the profitability of the wine, the profitability of their stay. And then we started to make yielding decisions around profitability. And that's just a simple example of taking data, a data pool like the revenue stream or the sales cycle and marketing, and marrying that just with the expense side. And it goes well beyond that. But those are just a simple example how you can unlock. Companies today, I think, need to put more time and attention in this area.
One would say almost that they're almost looking at it short-term thinking, right? As opposed to over the long haul or long term. Would you agree?
I do, and I think where you see a real dichotomy is in real estate. Real estate is a wildly capital-intensive industry. I mean, last time I checked, buying large buildings is very expensive, and it's not a short-term game. So one of the key metrics in real estate is something called IRR, internal rate of return. And it really looks at how do you increase the value of real estate. Real estate trades at a very high multiple because the income is very predictable. So for every dollar you add to the bottom line, you can multiply that by 30 in multi-res, and that's the value creation. So if you start to think about that, that doesn't happen necessarily in 90-day increments. That takes time to unlock the value. And it's not all just on the revenue side. It's in other areas as well.
So based on that in your career, what solutions or approaches did you explore to see how you can unlock some of that value in your own role?
So I'm going to maybe go in a different direction because I think revenue is an obvious one. And I'm going to focus specifically on multi-residential properties just for a moment. And revenue is obvious in the context that in Ontario in particular, there is rent control, which essentially means that once you sign a lease, that is your rent, and that there will be a guideline increase, but it doesn't fluctuate with the market. The only time it fluctuates with real market is when it turns over, and then it resets with a new tenant to whatever the market rent is. We would model out, Christina, the probability of who was going to leave when across a portfolio of over 15,000 units. So I don't know how many residents that would be. And we could tell you with a great deal of certainty that a tenant, a specific tenant in a specific unit might move out 4 years from today, and that their rent in that unit would be under market by X dollars. And so we might incent our sales teams, our marketing people. We might even incent the next buyer coming in a certain way. It was dialed into a point where every single unit had its own price point, and every single unit had fundamentally its own promotions and sales and pricing strategy. And that allowed you to incrementally pop the value. On the expense side, there are 3 expenses that really drive the cost structure of multi-res. One is property taxes, hard to do anything with that. The second is utilities, and the third is employees. Let me take utilities just for one moment. We were using, and when I left, we were beta testing 3 artificial intelligence building automation systems that really looked at how do we optimize the mechanical systems in a building based on 150 different forecasting weather scenarios, including smart irrigation and so on. And so it looked at things like how long does it take to heat up the materials in a building? What is the load on the building? Where is the sun as it relates to the building? What is the forecast in the next 6 hours? Is it going down by 5 degrees? It constantly grabbed an enormous amount of data to optimize energy. We did the same with labor. A 10% improvement in labor across my last organization's portfolio was $3 million to the bottom line at a 30 multiple. That's $90 million in value just by creating 10% more effectiveness, efficiency within your labor force. And everybody knows there's 10% more opportunity. So those are a couple of examples.
Right. So it sounds like you really saw the value in applying the insights from your data. And it sounds like you appreciated that information really helped reduce your risks. But with computing power and new technologies absolutely overwhelming leaders today, what advice would you have for a data leader or business and data leader to help them not only streamline, but more importantly, appreciate the value of their data and help them unlock it?
I think you need a data strategy and a data platform. And I think that begins by shifting from taking a divisional approach to your data, which means that the marketing team has their marketing data and the P&L team or the finance team has their expense data and the salespeople have their data and HR has their data. And then, of course, each one of those verticals, each one of those disciplines uses the data to optimize performance, whether that is to make a better experience for the customer or a better experience for the employee or P&L, et cetera. But it's a very disparate view of the data. So I think step one is to understand what data do you have and in what format, and what data do you think you need, which is not always internal data. So what are the pools of data, both internally and externally, that you both have and would like? And then start to think about where you have gaps. How do you standardize your approach to collecting data? And I think longer term, as you start to think about these things, the world's moving at just this incredible rate. I mean, you and I were talking that the rate of change over the next 20 years will be greater than the change we've seen in the last 2,000 years. The information age has just exploded. And it's the first time, I think, in history where the amount of data being collected is actually starting to be paired with our capabilities of doing something with that data to actually unlock it with real computing and computational insights. But I think you've got to recognize that some of the data that we're capturing today will be perhaps irrelevant in the future. So how do you onboard and take off data off your platform as you go forward? How do you make it agile and adaptive going forward? So I think those conversations need to happen not at the divisional level, but at the C-suite level. And I think and again, if you go back to my comments that data is the equivalent of an asset, it has real tangible value, then that needs to sit at the highest levels in the organization and be part of an overarching strategic plan.
Absolutely. And going back to the whole divisional approach, why do you think the C-suite in particular are slow to adopt, right? This is not a new conversation with respect to the value of data and adopting insights to really derive value across the organization. But with new roles coming in, like a CDO and the evolving role of today's CIO, why do you think we're still slow to adopt that philosophy and approach, that agile approach that you referenced?
It's a great question. I can speak just from my experience, and my experience was you were drinking from a fire hose. It was oftentimes the solutions that were being provided to you were so narrow, and so sort of, um, particularly in the case of sort of the Internet of Things, the solutions were so narrow that they didn't solve the 1,500 other issues or opportunities that you saw in front of you. And so I think that senior people are overwhelmed, and there hasn't been, frankly, really great solutions out there. I mean, I just described in the labor model at my previous company that a 10% improvement in labor equaled $90 million in value. Now, would anybody underwrite $1 million worth of software to do that? Absolutely. But there are a bunch of those types of opportunities and issues. And how do you knit them together into an overarching technology roadmap and data strategy? That's where people go, whew. And meanwhile, in a publicly traded environment, you just finished writing your MD&A, and you're probably on to, planning for your next quarter call with your analysts. So it's slowly evolving. I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen. I think it needs to get simplified in a way that, companies aren't boxed in. They don't spend $1 million writing software to optimize your labor and then find out 90 days later there's something better. I mean, that's, I think, in the back of everybody's mind. The rate of change is so fast. They're like, geez, do I just wait? I don't know. Do I wait or do I go? I don't know. And so I think that's the dichotomy that a lot of people are facing in senior roles. They know there's value. They're just not sure how to approach that value right now.
So it's almost like you're saying that creating value from data and analytics, just data in general, is not a technical or data challenge itself. Is it more of an organizational challenge at this point, right?
No question. There's absolutely no question. It's not. This is not left for your IT department to figure out. And frankly, I think a lot of companies have hangover effects with technology that maybe they've implemented that didn't go exactly the way they hoped. Probably stretched the organization in ways that nobody really wanted. And so there's a certain amount of hesitation where when you say, hey, we're going to put in a new ERP system, or we're going to put in a new strategy on data, everybody sort of tenses up a little bit and goes, oh my God, here we go again. And so, track record matters. And track record includes, what was the return on that? And sometimes it's hard to measure, but there's no question that this does not, in my view, sit at all with your IT department. Your IT department needs to be a part of it. They need to have a voice. They certainly bring a tremendous amount of experience and guidance. But this is really about looking at ways to differentiate and unlock value, which in my view sits at the C-suite.
So if CIO or CDO listening had a data transformation initiative, what advice would you give them today? How would you tell them to approach it?
I think you've got to establish some driving principles. And one of them might be that we need to be agile. And what I mean specifically, because I know there's IT terms around agile, but what I'm really talking about is we don't know how our competitors are going to evolve going forward. We don't know what the economy is going to do a year from now. We don't know whether there's going to be another health crisis or world events. We don't know what we don't know in terms of information. So whatever we design needs to be able to adapt to the changes in environment. Our customers are changing every day, and collecting new information and allowing information that doesn't seem to bring us much value anymore to be able to be offloaded from the platform. I think the second thing that's really important from sort of a principles perspective is nobody, with all due respect to the consultants out there, nobody wants to bring in a consultant every single time you're trying to figure out the relationship between, a demographic or a persona and their expense and their profitability. Is a senior more profitable than a student staying at it in one of your apartments? And you don't want to become dependent externally, in my view, because those questions come up 1,000 times a week. And so you need to build those capabilities with simple, flexible tools that allow us to understand, is a student more profitable than a senior? And well, when does a student move in and when does a senior move in? And how does that work? And what's the decision-making process and so forth? And so my point is that these principles, when they're established, I think then help guide the C-suite team as to how you move forward. I found
Yeah.
great. Sorry, I was just going to add one more comment. I found it very educational to meet with consultants and people like yourselves, because I never lived in that world. And so it was really a part of getting educated around this by spending time with either Gen Squared or with companies like PwC and others. But no, as business unit leaders, that they don't have all the answers, and they don't own your success.
And I'm glad you brought that subject up, and it's all about coming in and do that knowledge share, that blended approach to approaching to delivering that solution, and imparting those pearls of wisdom and leaving it behind so that that team can then go about and be successful on their own without having to rely constantly if there happens to be a skills gap or a knowledge gap, right? And so it's really critical to come in and partner, and
Right,
it's really important to look at it as a way to deliver value together, so to
right,
speak.
right.
Right. Yeah.
And organizations, and I think you know this, particularly in public markets and where you're using third-party capital or equity raise, the idea of value has extended well beyond earnings per share to what everybody knows as ESG. Um, and it's organizations looking at things like how prepared is the organization for a pandemic? What is your resiliency? How are you dealing with environmental issues, diversity issues, global crises? Obviously, as it relates to sort of social requirements, building value inside the communities that perhaps you operate in. So the idea of just it simply being based on sort of Michael Porter's idea of a value chain, all due respect to Michael Porter, that was kind of built around the turn of the century and sort of the industrial revolutions, where if you're responsible for the bumper and I'm responsible for the wheels, and eventually what ends up happening is that we can improve quality and increase the output in a manufacturing environment. It's very divisional. We each have a small sliver and our task to put it all together. But I think that was sort of a business model that we've now shifted from sort of that industrial divisional approach to one that is information. We've been in the information age now for what, a couple of decades. AI actually has been around a couple of decades, but we're still learning. But it will evolve extremely quickly, and how organizations are actually organized. If you're still kind of organized in a very divisional way, then I think you're missing the opportunity to unlock value, because HR will focus on the HR value stream, and marketing will focus on the marketing, sales cycle and cost of acquiring customers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in there lies a different way in which we need to work.
It's almost like the voice of the business has changed, right? No
Right.
longer is it just a line of business, whether it's marketing or sales or finance, asking for that report. They're actually working with the IT department to understand, why do I need this report? What am I looking to get out of it? What are the outcomes?
Absolutely.
The things that you know today. What is
Yeah.
that one thing you could have done that you didn't get to do at this point in your career that you would like to do, or you would have liked to have done?
That's a great question, boy. And it's an easy one to answer. you end up spending, particularly at senior levels when you're working with other people's money, whether it's private or public, you spend a lot of time focusing on managing your message. You spend a lot of time reporting. And because there's this insatiable, intense appetite for yield on a risk-adjusted basis, it requires almost every sort of person and ounce of the organization's focus on performance. And it doesn't leave enough time to step way back from what you do day in and day out to be able to think about how sort of these plates are shifting around the globe, and how do we best position ourselves for that. And I would probably argue that a lot of C-level executives don't have the time or don't make the time, but wish that they could spend 50% of their time thinking, anticipating, exploring, learning, because that really informs where the company will go. And I would say I didn't make enough time for that. Like a lot of people, I recognized my role was not necessarily doing, but focusing on the future. But I would say I don't think I focused far enough or more broadly enough on the future.
Yeah, it's the value, speaking of value, of time, which in turn gives you creativity, which in turn gives you the opportunity to really think through things, right? So the value of time, which could be another discussion point all on its own, right?
That's right. That's right. And I think you're spot on when you say time allows you to see the relationship between things that you might not have thought even were related, and that there is value to be unlocked. But I think companies at all levels, including the IT department, needs to understand how their businesses are valued and how and where there is value to be unlocked. Because I think that people kind of get into this functional, task-oriented sort of business model. And so I think the world evolves and your customers evolve, and over a period of time you find that you're losing market share and you don't really understand why.
Right. Well, now that you've had some time, where do you see the future of data transformations moving?
I think I know that senior levels of the organization are talking about this. And I think that's the beginning. I think senior levels of the organization are thinking about the data pools. And I think that's important. I don't think that everybody completely understands with the explosion of IoT and the information that now, or data that now creates. And so I think I think that suppliers, consultants, vendors need to help organizations to not just focus on one tiny sliver of the value creation, and focus more broadly on a strategy that allows us to on and off technologies and data in a way that doesn't grind out an organization, that still allows it to operate and execute on the information and learnings from the data.
That's really great insight. And so with that, I think we're coming up on our time. I just wanted to say thanks again for joining us. I really appreciated you spending some time with us today. And it was great having you on Data Driven Leaders.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you for checking out this episode of Data Driven Leaders. This show is brought to you by Gen Squared, an organization dedicated to solving data and analytics challenges for the modern enterprise. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow Data Driven Leaders wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit gensquared.com to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.